Please welcome today's moderator, Naila Nasir, President of the Spencer Foundation.
Wonderful. Welcome. I'm so pleased to welcome you to the first webinar in the Brown at 70, the Unfinished Journey Towards Educational Equity webinar series. The series honors the 70th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision of 1954, which of course was a landmark legal case to desegregate schools. This first webinar will focus on progress, pushback, and policies that matter. And then we have 3 other webinars upcoming on February 10th. We'll be talking about the importance and scarcity of Black teachers. On February 21st, we'll be exploring a really important question: has desegregation worked? And on March 10th, we're going to talk about the big picture of Black education and the pursuit of democracy. This series is sponsored by the Learning Policy Institute and the Spencer Foundation, and co-sponsored by the California Association of African American Superintendents and Administrators and the National Coalition on Education Equity. And I wanted to mention that this series also comes out of a book, one there, that we recently published with Teachers College Press. It's a QR code to get to the website. And it also is a set of white papers that you can get on the LPI or the Spencer Foundation website. We're really excited to have this out in the world. So, as I mentioned, the title for our conversation today is Progress, Pushback, and Policies That Matter. And I can't imagine a more important thing for us to be thinking together about and talking about than this right now. I'm going to introduce our panelists in a moment. I'm going to say a couple of words first by way of framing what we're going to be talking about today. So, Pedro and Joaquin, in your chapter, you describe the history of educational equity as being both about great hopes and unfulfilled promises. And Linda and Sean, in your chapter, you provide in great detail a picture of the ways that there have been these eras of progress on reducing gaps in opportunity and periods of regression where the gaps get bigger again. And it's clear for me that 2 things are true. 1, progress is not linear. It is iterative and historically has ebbed and flowed in relation to many things, including the economic and policy context. And 2, it's critical, if our plan is to unlock progress, it's critical for us to collectively keep our eye on the ball around the goal, to be serious not only about undoing the history of racialized policies, practices, and funding structures that leave some without opportunity, but creating a vision for education in the future that opens up opportunity. And what we know is that the way to do that isn't to pretend that current inequality doesn't exist, even as we aspire to do something better. It's to understand how we got here and how we're going to work together to get someplace else. And I'll say one last thing by way of teeing up our conversation, and it's this: working towards equity isn't just the right thing to do to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to thrive. And it's not just for the benefit of Black and Brown children or those who aren't thriving in current structures. Working toward equity is so that our society thrives, so that we fully develop the potential of every young person, so that we steward the future of our nation and of our world. And with that, I'll introduce our amazing panel for today, and I'll do so in order of the presentations, their first time speaking today. The first is Linda Darling-Hammond. She is the president and CEO of the Learning Policy Institute and the Charles E. Ducommun Professor of Education Emeritus at Stanford University, where she served as the faculty sponsor of the Stanford Teacher Education Program, which she helped to redesign and which I taught in. Darling-Hammond is the past president of the American Educational Research Association and recipient of its awards for the Distinguished Contributions to Research, the Lifetime Achievement Award, the Research to Policy Award. She led the Obama Education Policy Transition Team in 2008 and the Biden Education Transition Team in 2020. Darling-Hammond started her career as a public high school teacher. The next, we will hear from Sean Darling-Hammond. There's a relation there, mother and son. Sean Darling-Hammond is an assistant professor at the University of California, Berkeley. He seeks to expand belonging and well-being by conducting research in 2 areas. 1, identifying K-12 policies and practices that help schools become inclusive, psychologically safe spaces for students of all backgrounds. And 2, identifying social policies that combat and sideline racial bias. He's an interdisciplinary scholar drawing on psychology, education, law, public policy, and public health. And he's published in top-tier peer-reviewed journals like the Science Advances and Nature Human Behavior. And his work has been covered by major publications like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and NBC. Then we'll hear from Pedro Noguera. Pedro Noguera is the Emory Stoops and Joyce King Stoops Dean of the USC Rossier School of Education. He's a sociologist whose scholarship and research focuses on the ways in which schools are influenced by social and economic conditions, as well as by demographic trends in local, regional, and global contexts. He's published over 200 research articles, monographs, and research reports, and is the author of several books. He is a member of the National Academy of Education as well. Noguera was also a classroom teacher in public schools in Providence, Rhode Island, and Oakland, California, and maintains close ties to schools and educators. And last but not least, we will hear from Joaquin Noguera, who is an assistant professor of educational leadership at Loyola Marymount University School of Education. He teaches in the Educational Leadership for Social Justice Doctoral Program, as well as in the Master's in Credentialing programs. He's a former social worker, K-12 teacher, school leader, and director of the International Youth Leadership Institute, dedicated to serving Black and Latinx youth in New York City. His research is situated at the intersections of race, culture, power, education, and social justice, and engages three broad areas. One, the limits and possibilities for transformation and healing of education and schooling, particularly for Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities, and in low-income urban contexts. Two, systems change that advances racial equity in organizational contexts. And three, critical analysis of society and culture and the impact of social and cultural patterns on the development and experiences of individuals and communities. So we're going to hear from each of the panelists for about 5 minutes, and then we'll turn to an open discussion, and we will also invite in audience questions. So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Linda.
Thank you so much. I am thrilled that we are getting launched on this series at this time. It is critically important. And I'm going to share a couple of slides as we go along. I'm going to just try to make a very important point, reinforcing what you've already noted, that policy can make a difference, but we go through these eras of pushback, progress and pushback. And I'm looking for my slide. There we go. Let's see if that will work. And that's really the frame that I'm going to bring to this. We could go back even further than Brown, of course, to the times of, we could go back through history, but the time of Reconstruction, for example, when there were many, many reforms that were going on. Black legislators were selected and elected throughout the South, brought public education to the South before Jim Crow and more attacks on voting rights came into being, and then we had to counteract those and so on throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. After Brown itself, there was massive resistance in the 50s and early 60s. They closed public schools to avoid integration in some places. There was very grudging desegregation, firing of Black teachers and administrators. But ultimately, in the 60s and 70s, we made substantial progress under President Kennedy initially, and then President Johnson, with all of the major education laws enacted in that period of time, putting more money into the communities that needed it the most, desegregation litigation and federal assistance for desegregation, higher education scholarships. I know I benefited from many of these reforms as I was coming through school, and others I'm sure on this panel have as well. The war on poverty also reduced childhood poverty and provided lots of supports for communities. And all of those things led to the greatest gains in achievement and the greatest lowering of the achievement gap of any era in our history. And you can see that in the 1980s, after all of this had been put in place, Black students, who are that red line, had deeply climbed in achievement. The reading achievement gap was cut in half during that period of time. But then in the 1980s, in the Reagan administration, almost all of those policies were eliminated or sharply reduced. And the achievement gap grew again, and it is today 30% bigger than it was 35 years ago. And that's because while we've had some moments of progress in there, we've also had these continual moments of pushback, which is where we are today. One of the policies that was set in motion by Reagan and reinforced in multiple administrations, we're going to see that again in this administration, is the growth of disparities in wealth. And you can see that there was a substantial gain in net household worth for white households over that period of time, beginning in the 1980s and since. And you can follow the presidential administrations in this line graph, and there's been almost no change in the wealth of Black households. And that is part of the policy construct that continues the anatomy of inequality that we have established in this country, which is growing childhood poverty and poverty among Black households, and segregation increasingly in schools that are 90+% low income, and usually in across the country and certainly in California, Black and Latino are the 90% or more of students are in those segregated settings, and they've increased over these years. Unequal school resources are piled on top of that, and then we get inequitable distribution of well-qualified educators, high-quality curriculum, and often dysfunctional schools. All of this is not a function of the individual teachers and principals in those schools, but a function of the system in which we've constructed these realities. That inequitable distribution of qualified educators also then leads to low quality instruction, not enough understanding of students and their learning needs and ability to scaffold for those needs. Exclusionary discipline also follows that, and implicit bias sort of expands the effects of all of these things with assumptions that students don't care or families don't care, and harsh discriminatory treatments that really expand the inequalities that otherwise have been put in place by the social policies that we have established. But we do know a lot about what matters in growing achievement and what policies can make a difference. We know that school finance reforms that increase funding for low-income students do improve educational attainment. They close gaps, they improve later employment and wages. We have many, many studies to that effect. There are only about a dozen states that currently have more equitable funding formulas that are also adequate. So we have a long way to go, but we are making progress there, and we need to continue to lean in. High quality preschool boosts achievement and reduces special education placements, grade retention. Again, we're making some progress there, but we have a long way to go across many, many states and in many communities. Having fully prepared teachers who are also experienced, and when they are accomplished, as you might see with national board certified teachers, makes a huge difference in learning opportunities. And in one study, they found that it accounts for larger achievement gains than race and parent education combined. But we don't, in all cases, in all states, invest in high quality teachers and administrators. We should be underwriting their preparation and enabling them to be distributed equitably across all schools. We know that having a Black teacher for even 1 year, and certainly even better when it's more years, significantly increases achievement and graduation rates in college going for Black students. So diversifying the education workforce and giving Black teachers and other teachers of color the opportunity to come into the profession well prepared, without debt, and to stay in the profession because it is adequately resourced is critical to making the difference that will close the achievement gaps. Being at a community school with wraparound supports improves achievement and graduation rates. We know that it is still the case that 40% of Black children live in poverty, which is unbelievable and outrageous at this moment in history. And that comes with, housing instability, food instability, a variety of other challenges that of daily life for the family as a whole. And so we need to both be correcting those conditions, but also providing school supports that allow kids to get what they need to be in school fully. And finally, we know that social emotional supports and restorative practices improve achievement, graduation, and mental health. It's one thing to desegregate schools, but that's not sufficient if students are experiencing hostility and discrimination within the school. And that is very much the case in many, many places. So we've got to figure out also how to create inclusive environments. Now, we are making progress on all of these dimensions, and we know that Black students gain the most when they have access to these resources, as do other students of color and students who live in poverty. But we have to really continue to join hands to advocate for these policies at the state level, at the local level, together. And we'll come back to this question about what can we do with the resources that we have available today. I'm going to pass the ball to Sean.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much, Mom/Linda, for that incredible introduction to this talk and overview of what we need to focus on as we move forward. So from a legal perspective, and this is me speaking as an attorney who practiced in education law for a few years, Brown stands from the proposition that students of all racial backgrounds should have equitable access to the kind of education that allows them to realize their full potential and to thrive. And in the years since Brown, one thing that we've learned is that when students spend time in schools that center relationships and are rooted in inclusion, that students tend to flourish. However, we've also learned, and some of my research has contributed to this burgeoning knowledge, that when students' scholastic experiences are devoid of trusting relationships and replete with exposure to exclusionary practices like suspensions and expulsions, that they suffer markedly. For example, students who are suspended are more likely to exhibit depressive symptoms, disconnection, they're more likely to drop out of school, and they're about 7 times more likely to be incarcerated as a juvenile or as an adult. So exclusion is anathema to opportunity. And in an article I published last year, which this chart is demonstrating or sort of summarizing, we discovered that no matter how you slice the most recent federal data, Black students are far more likely to be excluded and punished than their peers. So this chart is showing among any given student subpopulation how much more likely Black students are to be suspended than students of than white students here. So you can see, for example, among all students, Black students are markedly more likely to be suspended among boys, among girls, among special education students, even among preschoolers. And we see some pretty marked distinctions in alternative schools. So the question then becomes, what can we do? Here we go. So one thing that many districts are doing is combating our reliance on exclusionary discipline and practices and combating these disparities in exclusionary discipline via restorative practices. And I'm going to say this term is kind of a catch-all nowadays. It's a boogeyman to some, it's a panacea to others, but a lot of my research is about identifying what works at reducing exclusionary discipline and disparities. And the kind of restorative practices that tend to work are a capacious kind of restorative practices that at minimum include both community building practices to ensure that students are enjoying many rich relationships in school and repair practices to respond to student mistakes when they occur. But that's not enough. That's not all it is. It's also an approach that is universal so that every staff member has training and support so that they can be relationship oriented and inclusive in their interactions with all students. And it infuses other practices. So if there are PBIS, positive behavioral intervention and supports, or social and emotional learning practices in a school, those are also relationship-centered, inclusive, and designed to try to ensure that students really feel connected to one another. So what happens when schools utilize this kind of capacious restorative practice programming? So in one study that I published with LPI actually 2 years ago, we explored what happened for schools that increased their utilization of conflict resolution practices, that ensured that students throughout the school were getting exposure to them. And what we found was that in schools where conflict resolution became the norm, misbehavior went down, gang membership and victimization went down, responding directly to critiques that restorative practices are soft and result in more misbehavior. We saw the opposite. But so too did depressive symptoms, sleep deprivation, and illness, echoing the importance of creating inclusive spaces to ensure students have psychological safety and can grow and thrive. So too did substance use, students turning less to that form of self-medication in order to respond to the challenges of being in an exclusionary space. And GPAs and school climate expanded prolifically. So in response to the question of what can we do, we can create the kinds of spaces where restorative practices are the norm for all staff and all students. And I'm going to pass the ball now to Dr. Pedro Noguera.
Thank you, Sean, and greetings. It's great to be with all of you. I want to thank the LPI for organizing this and giving us a chance, the Darling-Hammonds and the Nogueras, to present together a unique opportunity. So let me start by saying that we are at a critical juncture, but we have been at critical junctures before. I've been in several events where we've marked the anniversary of Brown, and over the last 20 years or so, we keep coming to the same conclusion that we're not making a lot of progress. That as a nation, the commitment to desegregating schools, to racial equity, has diminished, and we're seeing it in the data Linda shared a while ago. On achievement, we're also seeing in the kind of data that Sean shared. And much of this can be attributed to the fact that the courts have pulled back. Both Democratic and Republican administrations have not exercised a lot of leadership in advancing these issues. And so consequently, what we see is a general pattern that rather than education serving as a pathway to greater opportunity, in too many communities, what we're seeing is that it reproduces inequity. And I think the danger here is to think that this is a permanent situation. Now, many of us know that the moment in 2020 of the murder of George Floyd brought about massive changes across the country because there was a movement for racial justice across the country. And that is the qualifier I want to add there. When there's no movement, there tends to be retrenchment. And we're seeing that retrenchment now in the form of the book bans, the bans on DEI, and now with the Trump administration ready to implement the Project 2025 that we knew about, we'll see these accelerate in the next few years. And so in our discussion, we can talk about what that might look like and how those can be resisted. But I want to point out that beyond these kind of overt political challenges, underlying all of it is what I would call structural racism. And that is the ways in which racial inequality have been baked into U.S. society since the very beginning, since slavery, since the days after slavery. And while it's not to say there hasn't been progress, but the fact is that in every major city across the country and many minor cities, there are what we might euphemistically call Black ghettos. And it's so normalized that you would think that, well, ghettos are just universal, and they're not. And all you have to do is go to Canada and you realize there are many Black communities that are thriving. Just go to Windsor, Ontario, right across the border from Detroit, and you'll find one. And so there's a particular American issue that we've got to grapple with. And we have to recognize how that in turn shapes education. So to illustrate the point, my colleague Tyrone Howard at UCLA, who I think many of you know, and I did a study a few years ago on what was happening to Black children in LA County specifically. And we wanted to know why it was that even as the population of Black students declines, the outcomes for Black students continue to be so adverse. So not only are those achievement gaps still wide, the discipline gap still wide, the low college enrollment, particularly at UC and CSU schools. But, and this is the part that is very important to keep in mind, Black children experience hardships outside of school at a much greater rate, from asthma rates to homelessness to foster care placement. This map of LA County shows the areas that in the darkest, and those are the areas in South Central LA and even Antelope Valley, these are the areas that have the lowest Human Development Index, right? And these are where Black people tend to be more likely to be concentrated. Now, Latinos are there, poor whites are there, right? So this is not simply a Black issue. It's a class issue as well. And I think that's a very important point for people to keep in mind. And so there's a correspondence between the economic patterns and the educational patterns. And what that tells us is that we cannot simply focus on what happens in school in isolation. We have to think about what's going on outside of school. And this is why the work that LPI has been supporting and promoting around community schools is so critical, because schools are often the place where children can get access to food, to shelter, to adult supervision, to basic health care. And we have to make sure that that is happening. We have to make sure that policymakers understand clearly that if they want to change outcomes for students, they're going to have to focus holistically on the needs of those students and not simply on their test scores. As I said, the data shows a disproportionate number of Black children are experiencing things like trauma and asthma. And so the real critical question is, what can we learn from the schools that are showing us it's possible to raise achievement, improve outcomes? And I have 3 that are doing just that. The Martin Luther King Drew Magnet, Science Magnet here in Watts, the Gala School that's about a mile away from USC campus in South Central LA, and the Early College Academy in Compton. Compton's doing a great work right now. What's important here is to acknowledge that while the structural conditions are still there, what's different is the work of the educators and how they are serving kids. And so I want to, and I'll come back to this in our discussion because I believe I'm out of time, is that we're going to have a multi-pronged strategy here. We're going to have to use the courts when we can, but realize that the courts are limited. We'll also have to do a lot more grassroots work, which is very important for educators to understand that they've got to be organized with parents to promote these issues. And then we've got to look at ways in which to build institutions in our own community that serve the needs of our children. So let me stop there and turn it over to Joaquin Noguera.
Thank you. Also just want to extend my gratitude to the Learning Policy Institute for the chance to work with my father on this project and to present and engage all of you today alongside the Darling Hammonds. It's a pleasure and an honor. So I work at Loyola Marymount University. I am a professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and teach in the EDD program, the Educational Leadership for Social Justice, as well as the credentialing programs and the master's program. And one thing I have found to be extremely important is to address my students' need to develop knowledge of inequity in education, as well as address the need to know how to address inequity. And so we engage in historical analysis initially when we first get together. I often use this image here, School Begins, which was created back in 1899. This is kind of talking teacher language, educator language, right? This is a document-based question. And we interrogate this, we examine this. It was an expression not only of satire at the time, but also a cultural artifact. And here, you know, we'll just kind of give you a moment to take in what is being represented. We try to decode what is shown here. And then we make connections with our own experiences. And consistently, what students point out is that many classrooms look like this today. Although it may not be an older man in a suit with a stick in his hand in the front of the class, a teacher often represents the state, right, the federal government, or power. And different students have different relationships to classrooms, to school, to the learning that takes place in the class. But we also then draw attention to the different relationships that the different individuals in this image who represent larger communities have with learning and teaching. And that becomes a starting point for understanding schools as sites not just of hope and possibility, but also institutions that have been complicit in the reproduction of inequality over time, right? Schools as sites of injustice. And from there, I have found it to be really important to not just think of structural racism, which is important to grasp as something that is shaping schools and shaping school experiences in schools. But kind of zooming out a bit and considering structural racism as a form of violence, right? And I think there's power in understanding it as a mechanism of violence, because violence, when we have a conversation about violence, we're often eventually coming to a need to recognize how we stop the violence or how we might protect from violence, how we could recover and heal from violence. So drawing from a framework on violence, we can explore what structural violence is, right? And we might think of structural racism as a manifestation of structural violence. So this being a way that we hinder certain groups, or certain groups have been hindered from equal access to opportunity, to the goods and needs, services that we need. Cultural violence, the ways that we develop social norms, or we naturalize the inequity that results from or coexists with structural violence. So cultural violence we might think of as kind of expecting, as my father pointed out, for an all-Black neighborhood to be a ghetto, right? Or an all-Latino, Latine neighborhood to be el barrio, right? And what we often mean is these are coded terms that signify that they are under-resourced, that they may be food deserts or food apartheids, that there may be a lack of access to what we need, right? And then direct violence being direct actions that compromise one's well-being. It's important to note that all three forms of violence shape what happens in schools. And what I encourage educators to think about is not only understanding what that violence looks like into schools and within schools, but then what might protection and responses, healthy responses to counter those forms of violence look like? How might we counter and respond to or protect from the effects of structural violence, cultural violence, direct violence? And inevitably, this leads to conversations about what we're doing. And part of kind of the short of it for educational leaders, what I point towards is we need to work with the tension between what we know students need, what the research shows, and I draw heavily from the Learning Policy Institute's many resources that they've put out on whole child learning, on opportunity gaps, right? Based on what we know we need and where we are. We need to have an accurate understanding of where we are. And that's where we pull. That's where we stretch the system. That's where we stretch ourselves. It's also important to know that this work is not happening in isolation, right? The great Paul Farmer, the late great Paul Farmer, described the erasure of history, of our progress, of our struggles, is itself a symptom of structural violence. And I think it's important to recognize that what we're seeing right now at the federal level under the Trump administration is an aspect of that. In the first year I taught a DEI course, only 9 out of 12 students knew what Brown versus Board of Education was. Only 1 out of the 3 who said that they knew what it was willing to speak about it, was comfortable doing so. And more recently, Nicole Hannah-Jones was taken to the internets to remind us that it's important to recognize DEI and affirmative action can only be properly understood when recognized as outcomes of the civil rights movement. So she said recently, rescinding a 60-year-old executive order prohibiting discrimination in federal hiring and federal contracting is not anti-DEI, it is anti-civil rights. And that takes me to part of what I think we need to be doing, which is reconceptualizing, reimagining our schools. So I introduced this term, repurposing, right? How would we take something, an institution that was not designed to ensure that all of our needs are met, right? To promote equity and equality, and turn them into spaces that can actually help us be more well. And I'm just kind of, my eye on the chat there, I see that folks are saying, well, what about our teachers, right? We need to ensure that our teachers are well so that they can do their best for our students. This is the work. This is part of the work ahead, right? Repurposing our spaces into community responsive institutions where we're more well when we participate in them. So with that, I thank you, and I think I'm passing it back to Naila.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you all so much. You've given us a lot to think about. There's some questions coming through in the chat. Keep them coming. I am hearing loud and clear. You want to know what to do right now. We had a bunch of executive orders about DEI, and you want to hear folks talk on that. We're gonna get to that, I promise. I wanted to start though by just asking the panel to talk a little bit with one another. What, do you have questions or thoughts after seeing and hearing one another's presentations?
I definitely do. For Dr. Pedro Noguera, you mentioned that there were things that the three schools that you identified were doing that allowed them to buck the trend, overcome structural racism and disadvantage, and that it had a lot to do with the teachers were up to. But you didn't have enough time to talk about it. So I wondered if you could help us get a sense of what teachers are up to in those schools.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And it's important to note that those three schools I mentioned, one is in Watts, one is in Compton, the other one is in South Central LA. Let me talk about that one, the Gala School, which was created 10 years ago now. Not only is this school growing, right? It is integrated. It's one of the few racially integrated schools with a waiting list in LA. And when you look at what they offer basically what you would see at any affluent suburban school, right? In terms of honors courses, AP courses, they have a particular focus on young women. And so they're really promoting STEM, science and technology and education. But internships, these are the kinds of things that if we were talking about a school in an affluent suburb, we'd say that sounds pretty typical. It's not typical in the kind of communities I'm talking about. These are learning opportunities and highly skilled teachers, to go back to a point that you and your mom made, that are there with these students. And so I think the real question we should ask is, why can I only name three? Why can't I name dozens that are like this? That should be the case.
Yeah. Can I just note that Compton, which is one of the places you referenced, used to be under state receivership. It is now. It's been climbing in achievement every year and is really, it's getting awards from around the world, actually. What did they do? You know, they got really, they focused on, you know, teacher development, lots of the professional development for teachers, but STEM education, STEAM education, bringing in the arts, project-based learning, robotics, getting kids engaged in coding and, you know, all kinds of 21st century oriented careers. So they abandoned this idea that we should sort of stick kids in a sort of, you know, drill and kill test prep environment to get achievement up, and really created these environments that are engaging, exciting, deeply supported by the central office and in terms of the supports for teachers and administrators, as well as for kids.
Oh, thank you for that. Any other thoughts or comments from the panel before we move
Well,
to?
I wanted to ask a similar question of Dr. Joaquin Noguera, because he also ended without being able to finish the thought about, you talked about how schools really need to be repurposed and, you know, redesigned. We're working at LPI with a Center for School and System Redesign, you know, for, I think, similar goals to what you are articulating there. But could you say just a little bit about what you think are some of the fundamental elements of that redesign?
Sure. Yes.
And repurposing, I like that term.
I so appreciate the work you all are doing at the Learning Policy Institute. Again, I draw heavily from the reports, the policy and research reports that are coming out of your institution. And part of what I have found to be really important is that people clarify the vision. What are we doing? What is school? What do our schools need to be? The research on whole child learning, the research on opportunity gaps, on the importance of culturally responsive pedagogy, on brain development, the various dimensions of progress we have made in terms of what we know now about how to support human beings to learn and do their best. We have to bring some of that into how we do work, and it can't be just held in the hearts or minds of educational leaders, right? They have to adopt a relational stance and engage their communities so that we can develop shared understandings. So I think part of that is like about vision, setting a vision, creating a vision, working together to do that. I also draw from the work of, I think it's Shane Saphir, the book Street Data, right? They speak to the need to engage community and bring in the experiences of stakeholders to help define what is what, right? What is working, what's not working. It's important to use big data, right? The quantitative data sets but we also have to fill in the gaps with people's lived experiences. And so again, in adopting a relational stance and working towards relational accountability, it's really about recognizing that equity, as Naila pointed out at the beginning of this talk, is not just for individual growth, it's for our well-being as a society, right? And that in itself is a relational stance. So again, I'm advocating for schools to be recognized as relationally necessary institutions that are community responsive to the communities that they serve. And there's no, I don't think there are ways to cut corners. We have to make time to be with one another and work together to mobilize our communities.
Yeah.
You know, and just on this term repurposing, which I see people in the chat resonating with, when we invented we didn't do it, but when people invented the factory model school 100 years ago, the purpose was very explicitly to select and sort. And to do that with the assembly line, you know, sort of metaphor of how the kids would go through, and to do that in a way that was race and class determined, right? Because eugenicists were very involved in the design of the factory model school. So when we think about repurposing, it's partly around developing an institution and a place that is for the development of human potential rather than to select and sort. And that causes us to question a lot of what is in the framework and the policy environment for schools.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. So I want to turn to what feels palpable and pressing with the folks that are with us this afternoon. We're in a moment. There's no doubt about that. And we've had some, you know, a set of executive orders. We've had a kind of backlash to equity work that's been building and taking shape for a while. What thoughts, how are you all thinking about this moment? And what advice do you have for folks about navigating the executive orders, the implications for how the environments that folks are working in may be shifting?
I'd like to jump on this one for a minute, just having been through a couple of presidential transitions and now an anti-transition, because the DEI, you know, the stopping of the DEI, all the executive orders and so on. I think one thing people should be aware of is that they are framing a lot of this work around the language. So language is what, you know, they're going to comb people's websites for references to DEI. But you can do the things that you would do to enhance diversity and to promote equity and to include students without that label. You can do that work, you know, because it is affirming and it is educational and it is strategic and it is all the things that you want to do. And I think be aware that a lot of the policing and enforcement is going to be around labels, you know, labels like SEL, but you can talk about life skills and so, you know, support systems and, you know, so number one is just to be aware of that. Number two is, and keep doing the work and do the work, you know, by talking about it in the most fundamental ways without you know, the labels that are being sort of weaponized. The other piece is that there are lots of folks who are organizing right now to make sure that work can continue. So a number of organizations, including LPI, have been downloading the guidance from the Department of Education and the websites and the data sets. That guidance can continue to be used. It is still legal to use it around everything from, you know, supporting desegregation to supporting restorative practices, et cetera, et cetera. And there's an organization being formed called Democracy 2025. You can Google it. More than 300 organizations that are organizing themselves to be rapid responders to attacks on civil rights, including both of the major teachers associations and some other education organizations.
Yeah, thank you, Linda.
Can I just also point out that the federal government still, unless they change this, and then I think they're going to have to take it to the courts, still requires districts to report data based on race, right? And so there's a contradiction here to say that you want to see the data, and see a performance disaggregated by race, and at the same time, but you cannot address it. I think Linda's point that you can do so without, using the same labels is what we precisely have to think about. How do we do that? I've often said when I've been approached by district leaders about DEI, I said the superintendent should be the DEI leader, because until it penetrates the entire system, it often doesn't do much at all. So I think there's a time to really shift the way we think about the work to make it much more central and away from the margins.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you both for that. Quickly, because it just came up in the chat, I imagine, Linda, you'd be probably best qualified to speak to this. The threats about eliminating the Department of Education, how should people be
Not
thinking?
going to happen. They've already decided not to do that.
Yeah.
So we can move on to other things. that are
Short,
more-
sweet, to the
but
point.
the threats about eliminating civil rights protections are very real. And so, that is something we have to be aware of, and, organizing to keep those. A lot of the action may move to the states. The states can enact both protections for civil rights, as California has done. We went into legislative session right after the election to add to the protections for civil rights and to immigrants' rights. So those who are in this state, but other states as well, are stepping up, and those to be able to enhance the protections. This is where federalism comes in handy, because states can do more than the federal government, but there will be states that want to do less, and that's going to be the other piece of where we have to help people get connected to the protections that are getting organized. We don't always say this, but we should thank God for lawyers, because lawyers are going to be very important in this next period, as Pedro said, and as Sean reminds me from time to time that that is how we're going to we are a nation of laws. We will continue to litigate a lot of what is going on.
Yeah, thank you. So we have a really varied audience with us this afternoon. There are teachers, there are school leaders, there are district administrators, there are scholars. People are likely wondering, and this is coming up in the questions a bit, what can they do? So could you each offer a suggestion at any one of those kind of levels? What's your advice about what folks can do now?
I would the simple answer I would offer is do something. Watching the news, scrolling on your social media is not taking action. That actually reinforces hopelessness, right? Get involved locally, get involved at some level, whether it be by being involved. For example, it's very unfortunate, but there was a very active group of Black parents in Pasadena, which now has been impacted by the fires, but they had been organizing for years to advocate for Black children, to advocate for their needs. Support groups like these, and where they don't exist, help to create them. Because I think that what we've got to realize is we only make progress when there is activity, organization, when there's movement. And so we cannot just wait for someone to save us.
Can I jump in there? I think this is somewhat related also to the first question we got. And it's related to this issue of like shock and awe being a strategy of the Trump administration right now, which, as folks are pointing out in the chat, it contributes to fear and paralysis, right? Confusion, even confusion about, is this still valid? Reporting on disaggregating student data by race, for example. And we actually have to continue to maintain a clear vision of what we're doing, right? What is our school? What does it need to be for our community? And part of what I'm trying to integrate into some of my own scholarship right now is this research that shows in an unhealthy society, like we are in right now, part of what we can do to support recovery, to support well-being, is to interrupt three different areas. Interrupt experiences of isolation, toxic experiences of stress, and fatigue. right? Fatigue comes with the work. The stress comes with the work also, but we don't have to work in isolation. And so many of the examples that were shared on this panel today are examples that demonstrate people working together, mobilizing, and again, practicing relational accountability. I think that's got to be the work as we move forward. Intentionally targeting the isolation, stress, and fatigue to interrupt it, to allow for recovery so that we can do our best when we're together and actually working together.
Yeah, thank
I
you.
just
Laura.
like
I'll
to,
add to that. Oh, go ahead.
yeah, no, you go, Sean.
I'll add to that because I think that that's very much my lane is beyond just interrupting isolation, interrupting the fatigue that comes with the sense of being disconnected from others. How do we enhance connection? How do we ensure that there's expansive belonging? And so what I would recommend, this is something that's very much felt urgent to me since the major political shifts, is to future dream a little bit with the hearts of children in mind. Our children are in a period of intense stress and fear and disconnection from one another. We have still no clear idea what the rampant increase in utilization of devices has done. And I mean like social media has done for students' social and emotional connectedness and their skills, their sense of safety. They are facing wildfires. They are facing pandemic-related after effects. They are facing the fear of school shootings. It is a very stressful time for them. So what can we do to try to ensure that when they come into school, they feel truly safe, truly connected, and make that the thing we can be proud of at the end of each day? And you do it for a day, then you do it for a week, and then you do it for a semester. And suddenly you have an inclusive, a radically inclusive space that is safe. And it doesn't matter what's happening outside of that space because that is the safe haven for them. So that's what I encourage.
Thank
And
you
I'll
so-
just piggyback on that to say, to do that, particularly in middle and high schools, you need to redesign the factory model structures. Because having been a high school teacher with 180 kids a day coming by in groups of 30 for 60 minutes, 45 minutes at a time, I could care desperately about my students, but I could not care for them effectively. So I've worked with many, many schools that have redesigned themselves so that you create teaching teams and advisory systems where every kid is well known by an adult that they see every day, and a family group of 15 or 20, and where the parents are connected and they've got someone to call who will actually be able to pick up the phone and conference with them. And creating a relational environment means the factory model school is not designed for relationships. In fact, Max Weber was the father of bureaucracy, and he said bureaucracy is perfected to the extent that it is dehumanized, where rules become the metrics of how you behave rather than personal relationships. So if we have one adult for every 9 kids in our high schools, but teachers see a caseload of 120, 150, 180, 200, depends on the district they're in. And how did we get from 9 kids to that? It's the way we've divided up the time and the subjects and all the rest of it. My point is that there are alternatives. People are inventing them. They're thinking about how to design for relationships so that people can have the kind of relational, and that reduces stress for adults. It's a very different thing to be in an environment where you can be relational with the kids you care about, and in a teaching team where you're working together, etc. So we really have to think about this in every respect, policy-wise, school structures, as well as the way in which we step back. And I love the idea of dreaming, for our children.
Thank you. Thank you. Pedro, you want to get in on this question? Okay. Okay. So we have just a few minutes left. I want to get one question in for the researchers in the room. What you presented some amazing findings from the scholarship that you all have been engaged in. What do we not know yet? What should researchers be focused on in this era?
One thing we always need to know more about is how.
Mm.
We often know what. Like we know that if you do this well, it matters. We also know that implementation is the cup between the slip between the cup and the lip, as they say. You can get a policy in place, or you can get something in place, but then how you do that, which means that people have to learn from each other. They have to learn from others who've done it well. They've got to get research on how to implement things well. We've got to get rid of the American idea that you can do things overnight and see the results the next day, that there's going to be a timing and a process and all of that. But anyway, that would be one place where I think we need a lot more work.
I'll dovetail off of that because so much of my work is about that implementation step, that ensuring that we're actually doing it in a way that it works. And I'll sort of pivot. I'll do what a classic academic always does, which is instead of answering the question, I'll say what I was thinking. But I promise it's related. I think that what we don't know is how to operationalize relational and inclusive practices in every single context. And that's because it has to be operationalized in a way that works for that context. The unique stresses and pressures that any given district or school faces are unique to that district and school. But what I don't think we should do is be paralyzed by the possibility that we'll get it wrong and wait until we find that panacea answer. I'm sorry, this is my 5-year-old. I'll be right back, baby. I'll be right back.
Welcome
Sorry.
children
Come
into the
on in.
conversation.
He
Come
is,
on,
he
let's
is
see
a
'em.
contributor here. No, so I think it is critical that we take the brave step to try to implement with the guidance that we have, the knowledge that we have.
Thank you. Thank you.
I guess I'll go since
Yeah.
my father's pressing the brakes. I thought of the same thing as Sean, just that the work looks different across communities, across different contexts. Relational accountability is going to be interpreted and understood in different ways by different people based on their lived experiences and their needs. I think it's also important to recognize that equity work can be an opportunity for self-determination for communities that have been historically underserved when they have a seat at the table, when we are practicing relational accountability and including them in setting the vision. So we don't yet know what we need to do until we engage the communities that we hope to serve. And I'll stop there.
Yeah.
I mean, can I just reinforce that? Linda and Sean talked about the how, and I think Joaquin's speaking, but let's do that with the stakeholders, with the parents, with the students, with the teachers, because too often the research lives in one place and those who are doing the work, the practitioners, don't have access. And we need to bridge that gap so that it can be much more impactful than it is. So I would encourage those who are researchers to really work more closely with communities in both formulating questions, but also in making the research available.
Yeah, thank you. Any final thoughts as we near a close this afternoon?
I want to close with remembering the words of Frederick Douglass, who made the point that we're making here, that you have to have stamina, you have to have determination. This is going to be a 2 steps forward, 1 step back. He said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, it never will. Wherever there is progress, there must be struggle. And this is part of what is historically the case and will continue to be the case. And the key is to struggle together, to be in community, to put your bucket down where you are and find the colleagues in the community that will work with you.
Can I add one thing? I just finished reading the book James by Percival Everett. I want to strongly recommend it. It's also won the National Book Award. It's brilliant because it's done as a parallel to Huckleberry Finn, but it's so much a powerful narrative about education, because his character, Jim, or James, as he calls him, is an educated Black man during slavery. And what you see from the narrative is the power of education. And I think that is what gets lost a lot of times, particularly in this generation. I mean, there are too many young people who think college is not worth it, it's too expensive. We need to remind them it's not just about a job. Education is about power. Who has it is going to be determine who's at the table, whose voices are being heard, and whose rights are being defended. And we need to help students to understand that, because I think they've been sold a bit, bill of goods, that it's really only about a job or about something, your test scores, and it's about so much more than that.
Thank you. Thank you all for making this such a wonderful conversation. Incredibly grateful. And thank you to all who joined us, for being with us this afternoon, and for all the work that you do every day.